the Nintendo 64 turned 20 years old. Um, Now, as far as Nintendo consoles go, Nintendo 64 is kind of low on my list. And the reason for that is it's funny because we were just talking about cartridges and how interesting it would be for Nintendo to return to cartridges as their main form of media. But at the time that the Nintendo 64 was released, it definitely was a mistake to stay with cartridges for games back then. Simply because cartridges could not hold anywhere near as much as what a single compact disc could do. I don't even know how large they were. I think maybe the largest cartridge that was used for the Zelda games was 512 megabytes, whereas any standard CD was 700. And it just there's other aspects of the system as well. The controller, to this day, it's still one of the worst controllers ever.
I don't know how they thought people were supposed to use that.
And talk about, the one thing Nintendo does, one of the things Nintendo does really, really well, their stuff, their hardware lasts. I'm still using the same GameCube controllers that I bought way back in the early 2000s for Super Smash Bros. Melee. I've used them for Melee, Brawl, other GameCube games, by the way, but also Brawl, and now the Wii U version of Smash Brothers. I'm still using them. They're still responsive. They make good stuff, but for some reason, the joystick on these things just if you're rough on it at all, you will make it so that it basically doesn't rest on its neutral point. It'll lean one way or the other.
Yeah.
And when that happens, you might as well throw it out. Or I've actually seen a way you actually can order a GameCube control stick and replace the Nintendo 64 control stick with a GameCube one, and it works super good. So those are the negatives as far as I have for the system. That and the graphics for the N64, it was a more powerful system than the PlayStation was, but I felt like with the PlayStation you got a much more varied presentation for games. Like, this was still during the days where you could look at a game and you could tell if it was PlayStation or Nintendo 64. All the 64 games kind of had the same features. They all had horrible draw distance, and that means how far away you can see. A lot of them had fog used to kind of hide pop up or pop in of different objects that would come into view. There was a lot of blurry, muddy textures, and that was something that, like if you look at a 3D regular DS game, which actually lacks the ability to blend textures like the Nintendo 64 could. So if you look at something like Super Mario 64, the DS port of that looks a lot different because everything looks textures look pixelated. But it's weird. Like, I don't prefer one or the other. I just kind of look at them as different ways of doing textures in your game world. And if you blur them together or not, like if you blur them together, of course you lose detail overall. So I didn't like the fact that every Nintendo 64 game looked like that. It had just those blurry, muddy textures. That, and it couldn't push very many polygons at a time. So all the character models were very low poly. I think PlayStation did a little bit better with its character models. The good parts about the system, though, is it has a very when it has some of the best games ever made. Period.
Oh yeah.
GoldenEye 64, Ocarina of Time, the first Smash Brothers, Star Fox 64, Super Mario 64, Banjo Kazooie. Um, but it actually the library is not very large. I think it's only a couple of hundred games or so. Um, and that was because a lot of companies didn't want to pay for the expensive cartridges. So that was another reason why PlayStation outsold the Nintendo 64. But my experience with it, I think I owned the console for only a few years after the life cycle ended. Most of my memories are going over to my neighbor's house. I had a PlayStation, he had a 64, and we would just basically say like, "Hey, would you mind renting this game so I could play it?" I played through Ocarina of Time all the way through. My first one or two times on my friend's system, and he would actually come over and oddly enough play Mega Man Legends because he really liked that game. But yeah, it's strange because even though it has had some great games on it, there's just some really strange design choices that they made with the hardware. And despite its software library, which you can play on, I think the only game you have to play on a Nintendo 64 is GoldenEye. And they've even kind of remade that, although I don't think it was very well received. But Ocarina of Time, the original Smash Brothers, that's downloadable on the original Wii download channel. It's just it's not enough for me to overlook all the negatives of the system. It's honestly honestly my least favorite Nintendo console that they have produced. But those are my thoughts.
Well, thankfully, when I played on the 64, I was like a 4 or 5 year old little boy who didn't understand things like that and didn't look too far into that stuff. Although I do understand, and those are things that aren't great. Um, Although back then, as a little kid, also didn't agree with the controller. The controller was weird, um, and I knew that.
There's 3 different ways to hold it, but you'll only ever hold it one way.
Yeah. Um, and I want to say that I can't exactly remember just because my memory gets really fuzzy going back that far, but um, I think the Nintendo 64 was one of the first. It was either the first gaming system that I ever played, or the second. The only two consoles or game stations that I played at the time were a Game Boy Color that me and my brother both owned, and a Nintendo 64 that we didn't own ourselves, but at the time we were living with some friends because our family had just moved to Tennessee, and we were staying with them, and they had a 64, and we would play all kinds of games on it. Thankfully, they had two other sons, so all the multiplayer capabilities of all the 64 games, like we could play them all. We could also do single player. The I have only good memories of the 64. Just playing Donkey Kong, the multiplayer on that with them, which was a lot of people talk about Donkey Kong 64 just as a great game. They don't really talk about a lot of things. My favorite thing about that game was the multiplayer. I absolutely loved being like the different Kongs and
I
just
didn't even know
using.
it had multiplayer.
It was amazing. You didn't know that?
No.
That was all we did. Like we would play this. Like all four of us would let like one person control. I think it was the oldest person at the time. We let them just play through the story mode, and we just watched them, and we didn't care about playing. We just wanted to play the multiplayer, which was pretty much like um, it was a third person kind of like shooter.
Mm.
Like Donkey Kong threw like orange bombs. Diddy Kong's
Peanut
peanut
gun.
gun shooter. Like that's where that was from.
Yeah, I do remember that.
I think Funky Kong or someone else had like a coconut bazooka. It was really fun. And then Super Smash Brothers for the 64. That game started my love for Super Smash Brothers. That was where everything started. And I don't mean to brag, but as a 4-year-old, I could play fairly well for a 4-year-old. There were definitely times where the three other people had to gang up on me as Pikachu because I was a jerk with Pikachu. But just all the game library is just, I love it all. I love them all. I have fond memories of everything on that system. Only good things from playing that system, and I absolutely enjoy it and love it. So to hear that it's been like 20 years since the 64 has been around, just because that was a huge part of my life, and that's kind of like what started me up for playing video games. Like, it's cool just to know that little fact.
Yeah, and a couple other positives I just thought of with the system was I love the four player that you didn't need to go out and buy like a multi-tap or some other device that'll let you connect more controllers. It just did it out of the box on its own.
Yeah.
And also, that was the first system that had force feedback with the Rumble Pack. Star Fox 64 was, the first game to do that, and um, I can't I think when the PlayStation 3 first launched, the first generation of controllers did not support Rumble, and everyone was really bummed about it, including me. But luckily, they came to their senses, and we have Rumble back on pretty much anything you can play now.
Yeah.